Hi, epistemologists. So I'm very excited to share with you today this book, José Medina's The Epistemology of Resistance, Gender and Racial Oppression, Epistemic Injustice, and Resistant Imaginations. So this book is kind of an agglomeration of a lot of the ideas that we've seen so far and an application of them to problems in political philosophy and social political philosophy having to do with how we create a democracy. So today I'm going to give you a kind of general sketch of the argument at the beginning of this book and a small tiny summary of what we can expect, an outline of what we can expect in the rest of the book. But really, I'll just be talking about the introduction. I won't go into much detail about the content. And I'm going to try to be aiming this lecture so that it is a good enough lecture to get you on your way to reading the book, as much of the book as possible over the next couple of weeks. I will probably not be lecturing on every single section of the book that we read. So Medina's book is an attempt to solve the problem of living in a pluralistic democratic society where people have different experiences, they come from diverse backgrounds, and they don't always agree with each other. The problem of disagreement and diversity in a democratic society, and how to make this society equitable and how to make it sensitive to the needs of all of the people in that society. It's a very big problem. So I'm excited to try to tackle it. And we'll see whether or not his theory makes some headway. Maybe you agree with it, maybe you disagree with it. Either way, I think it's worth discussing because there's some new ideas in here that really are pulling together a lot of the threads that I've been interested to put to you throughout the semester. So the very first thing that Medina tells us he's trying to do with this book is to fight insensitivity. Insensitivity is, according to him, quote, being cognitively and affectively numbed to the lives of others, being inattentive to and unconcerned by their experiences, problems, and aspirations, and being unable to connect with them and to understand their speech and action, unquote. So basically, we're aiming to actually not be numbed to the lives of others, to be sensitive to the lives of others, to be attentive to and concerned by their experiences, problems, and aspirations, and to eventually, hopefully, be able to connect with them. And even, yes, he uses this word, even understand their speech and their action. And by they here, I mean every sort of they, every sense in which I am different from other people will be relevant here. We're not just talking about race, we're not just talking about gender, we're talking about everything. So when you think of yourself as a person in society, you're positioned in a particular place, and that informs, the ways in which society treats you, which then also tends to define privileges, oppressions, and all these other sorts of dynamic parts of the social net that we find ourselves within. And whether we have more privileged or less privileged or a mix of privileges and oppressions, we are going to be interested in, can we, as a society that wants to be a democratic society, move toward caring about the needs of the more disenfranchised among us and enfranchising them, right? While also hopefully paying attention to the ways in which we ourselves are ignoring, not attending to, not being virtuous epistemically. So what Medina is going to try to build in this book is what he calls an epistemology of resistance. And what is that? He tells us it has two parts to it. First of all, it has an analytic part, which tries to elucidate the epistemic aspects of oppression. So we're interested in figuring out how oppression manifests itself specifically epistemically. And this is something that will be familiar from having just read Fricker, right? She is trying to pull out the senses in which oppression can be epistemic in nature as opposed to something else. And the second part of this analysis of this epistemology of resistance is the normative part, which has to do with rules, norms, ways we should behave, right? How we should be toward each other. And the normative side of epistemology of resistance tries to offer a way out of the epistemic injustices that accompany oppression. So basically, we want to understand the epistemic aspects of oppression, and we want to try to ameliorate these epistemic aspects of oppression. We want to try to understand the web that we're in and try to find our way out of the web. So that we move toward a better, more pluralistic, just more ideal society than the one that we live in now. And of course, the things that lie in the way of us doing that include, of course, that as we talked about with hermeneutic and justice, it might require formulating concepts, and it might require questioning concepts that we've inherited that might get in the way of us understanding how to solve this problem. So we'll talk about epistemic injustices, and we'll also talk about what Medina calls epistemic resistance, which he says is the use of our epistemic resources and abilities to undermine and change oppressive normative structures and complacent cognitive effective functioning that sustains those structures. So epistemic resistance, he says, is a mode of relationality that is actually crucial for democratic sociability. So he's going to frame a whole model of democratic discourse that is going to incorporate the idea of resistance as actually a vital part of democratic society. We're not just talking about epistemic resistance as something that we put forward while we experience oppression because we're in a bad place. We're talking about epistemic resistance as a practice that we want to adopt and actually use to transform the way that we build our democratic structures. So we don't want to say once nobody is oppressed, if that were possible, but once nobody is oppressed, we don't need the epistemology of resistance. Medina thinks that actually the epistemology of resistance, this epistemic resistance, is going to be useful for any democratic pluralistic society, even one that is lucky enough not to have so much oppression going on. So it doesn't matter where on the spectrum you think that we are in the modern day, whether you think we're doing really, really well compared to other periods in history, and actually maybe it's not worth that much fuss, or whether you think we're doing really poorly and there's a lot going wrong, or maybe you're somewhere in the middle, or maybe you don't know. It doesn't matter where along that spectrum you are. This theory is going to have something, hopefully, to provide for us that's going to be worth talking about. And that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in presenting this idea to you. So let's start with one of the biggest culprits, one of the biggest reasons why Medina thinks we've gotten ourselves into some of the tangle we've gotten ourselves into. He starts with the question, what are the features, the epistemic features of our democratic practices, and what are the epistemic powers that go into democratic participation? What are the features of the way that we interact with each other in this society? Well, one of the features that he identifies is consensus or agreement as a model of how to conduct discourse, as an aim for our discourse. And he's going to say that trying to build consensus or agreement is actually going to get us in trouble. And in order to argue this, he's really relying on the research of Elizabeth Anderson, who's a terrific philosopher. She published an article called The Epistemology of Democracy in 2006 that he's really just kind of poaching for a lot of this, and he quotes her extensively. So I just want to note, this is part and parcel of Medina's book. He really is drawing on lots and lots of people's ideas to try to stitch them together into this vision that he's going to have of the epistemology of resistance. So Elizabeth Anderson says that consensus producing activities don't necessarily integrate what we think of as key features of democratic life, like diversity, interaction, and dynamism. So democratic life, if you think about, most democratic societies today, they try to be places where there can be lots of different types of people, and everybody, no matter what kind of person they are, can potentially have a say in what happens next in the society, right? That's what makes it democratic. And so if your democratic society cannot accommodate a certain amount of diversity among its constituents, then it's not really a democratic society. It's sort of failing to meet the ideals of democratic society. So if she says that the agreement model is sort of going to make us not able to meet the ideals of democratic society, well, that's a problem. So in what way is agreement not fitting well with diversity, interaction, and dynamism? Well, Think about it like this. Suppose that you wanted to form a committee of people, like just randomly chosen people in the community who were going to get together and decide on something, maybe something trivial, like where they should put traffic signs around town or something. And suppose that you expected the result of this was if anyone was going to make a decision, everybody in the room had to agree. So if we had a consensus model for how this process was going to work out. And suppose that you had 12 people going into this room together and they were all different from each other. No one person shared more than a couple of features with any other person in the group, except maybe that they can talk, they can speak the same language as each other, they can communicate a little bit, right? But if you have that group and you expect them 100% to agree with each other at the end of the process, you might find yourself in trouble, right? Because what's the guarantee that 12 people with very, very different experiences and information are going to be able to 100% achieve consensus? That might be unrealistic. And you might worry that if you're inputting 12 diverse people into a process and expecting to output one singular idea, it's not always going to work. 12 reduced to one, like how does this diversity become uniformity? That's a strange process. Whatever it is that you think is happening in the room, it's not like the process of actually being in that room, right? It's not like experiencing the diversity of this society, this community that has these 12 different types of people in it. The other thing that, according to Anderson, that the consensus model does is that it makes interaction really hard, right? Like think about democratic society. Suppose that any time that you interacted with someone who you knew had different political beliefs from you, you knew that they were aiming to change your beliefs, you probably wouldn't want to spend a lot of time interacting with anybody else, right? Like you wouldn't be inclined to have conversations with others because everything would be high stakes all the time. Like people are out there proselytizing about their political ideas and you have reasons why you've adopted yours. So why would you want to go out of your way to try to learn what about your ideas is wrong? Why would you want to constantly question your own reasoning, unless you're a good committed philosophical type of person who likes having arguments. But if you don't like having arguments, it's not going to be a lot of fun. You might want not to have any conversations at all if you're in that society that aims to have everybody have the same idea at the end. And finally, the thing that consensus does is its intention with this idea of dynamism, of having a dynamic society where our ideas change over time as we get more information and as we learn which of our policies have worked and which ones have not worked and who they're working for and who they're not working for, right? We want to try to be in a society where we're constantly amending and making better what we have as we find out our needs. And there's a sense in which if we expect consensus to come out, that feels very final, it feels very definitive and not like something you can revisit later. And so it's in tension with the idea of dynamism. And basically, this is the source of Anderson's critique, these three things. So the first thing that she talks about is the Condorcet jury theorem. And the Condorcet jury theorem, which she's interested in criticizing, says that for any choice, if there's a better than 50% chance of choosing the best option, the probability of the majority vote being right approaches 1, and the number of voters increases. And she really doesn't like Condorcet jury theorem. First of all, it's diversity neutral because it doesn't say anything about whether everybody has the same perspective going in. It just sort of predicts that no matter whether people have diverse opinions or not at the beginning, any choice, if there's a better than 50% chance of choosing the best option, the majority vote being right approaches 1. So like, it doesn't matter what the minority vote is. It only matters that like there is a majority vote. And so it doesn't, this is Anderson's criticism, make use of the resource of diversity. It actually erases the idea of diversity to produce that model. Second of all, she notes that democracy isn't just about voting, right? Voting is sort of a thing that you do at the end of a long discussion. And the discussion part, the talking part, is also crucial and essential to democracy. I mean, just think about, at least in the United States, the First Amendment to the Constitution is about freedom of speech. And we value along with the idea of freedom of speech, the idea of freedom of press, right? Getting information out, getting people to have conversations with each other about what the effects of policies are, about what the potential problems could be that we need to address as we go into trying to make laws or rules for people in our community. So the Condorcet jury theorem makes it sound like democracy is just about voting. But Anderson's like, no, what about all this talking part? And finally, her third objection to Condorcet jury theorem is that the success of laws and policies is a function of their consequences, not of their popularity. So if the Condorcet jury theorem says, oh, well, the likelihood that people will agree and then the majority will choose the best option, approaches one, blah, 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 all that stuff, that just sounds like voting on the law and policy. But whether or not a law and policy is actually successful has to do with what happens after you vote. The implementation of the law and policy and the consequences of the laws and policies, and not how popular it was when people voted for it. So Anderson says we need a model that can allow for self-correction and for learning. We need to be able to revisit anything that we chose that turned out to be bad. And I'm sure you can think of a piece of legislation that has been correctly overturned because we found out it wasn't being very effective, or maybe a policy that was changed because we discovered that even though it seemed like that was the right thing to do for some people, it wasn't the right thing to do after all upon reflection. So a democratic society needs to be able to revisit stuff like that, and the Condorcet jury theorem just can't accommodate that sort of concern. So she considers a second theorem, and that she's also going to criticize it. And the second theorem is called diversity trumps ability theorem. And this sounds more promising because it's got the word diversity in it, right? According to the DAT theorem, the solutions of complex problems require the pooling of resources of epistemically diverse agents. That sounds much better, because pooling of resources of epistemically diverse agents, that sounds like what we want. We want a pluralistic society. If the model makes use of that, that's great. One thing that it does get right, according to Anderson, is that it explains why democracy is better than technocracy, because it prioritizes diversity and interaction. However, she has an objection, and her objection is that it doesn't account for consequences again. It doesn't account for self-correction and for learning. It only accounts for all the stuff that happens before a policy is chosen, not what happens once a policy is chosen, and maybe we need to think about whether that was the right policy to have. Maybe there's some expectation that if you have like a diverse group of people making decisions, it'll be less likely that the decision they make is incorrect or something, less likely that we need to revisit it. But it doesn't seem like the likelihood is zero, right? Anytime we make a choice, because we're fallible beings, we're liable to need to revisit it. And so Anderson's really gunning for a model where where everything is potentially revisitable. And now I'm getting ahead of myself, but this is the thing that Medina is interested in introducing, what he calls the resistance model of democracy, as opposed to the consensus model of democracy. The resistance model is going to be a model on which it is important to center democratic communication, and in particular, dissent, to center dissent as a way of achieving a democratic society, and to also emphasize the dynamism of democratic epistemology, our ability to update our beliefs and our policies in light of new information. So that's what he calls the resistance model, and it's going to be different from the consensus model or the agreement model. Before we get into the details of that, I want to talk about a second answer that Medina provides to the question of what the epistemic features of our democratic practices are, and what are the epistemic powers that go into democratic participation. And this is what the second answer, besides the consensus answer, is what he calls experimentalism, which he takes from the philosopher John Dewey. So experimentalism says that the main basis of all education, which Dewey described as that, quote, reconstruction or reorganization of experience, which adds to the meaning of experience and which increases ability to direct the course of subsequent experiences, unquote. So the main basis of all education are these three things. And very quickly, before I talk about these three things, that quote was meant to emphasize that what's important about education for Dewey is reconstruction and reorganization, which adds to meaning. So we reconstruct and we reorganize as a part of learning, and that creates new meanings for our experiences. So that's what it is to learn, is to actually change the things that we thought before, not simply to like acquire, right? He talks about it as a reconstruction or reorganization. And there are three features involved in this learning process. First of all, the nature of the learner, what the learner's interests are, the problems that are involved, their developmental nature. Second of all, the values and aims of the society, such as the principles of cooperation, the level of tolerance in the society, the critical mindedness of the society, and their political awareness as well. And finally, the wider world of knowledge represented in the subject matter. So the knowledge in the various disciplines that helps the teacher present material that resonates with both learner and society. So Dewey is interested in this pedagogical model, which thinks of learning as reorganizing and reconstructing, and it has these three components of the individual learner and their nature, what they're interested in, what problems they want to solve, the values and aims of their broader context of society, what society wants from them, and then finally, what knowledge is represented in the subject matter that we're learning about. So these are the three elements that will be involved in reconstructing and reorganizing experience. So we have a social model of learning and education, which is all about revising, right, what we know, and revising both the learner and the society and the knowledge base itself, if necessary. That's all open book to Dewey. So Medina likes this experimentalist model, and he calls that experimental model a kind of resistance model. So he thinks that it explains what's important about democratic communication, and it has the ability to center dissent and the dynamism of democratic epistemology. And in this, he agrees with Elizabeth Anderson and Iris Young. So he says, democratic communication, quote, is the communication of diverse experience and diverse imaginations. It is aimed at putting our practices and institutions in sync with the heterogeneous experiences of diverse members of society, but also with the heterogeneous imaginations that individuals and groups can exercise. So here, democratic communication isn't just about talking and sharing experiences, it's also about structuring our imaginations and sharing our imaginative visions, if you like, of the future, the ways society could be and the way society is in our experience. He quotes Elizabeth Anderson here, who says, we should think of democratic deliberation as, quote, a kind of thought experiment in which we rehearse proposed solutions to problems in imagination, unquote. So kind of like the purpose of our conversation with each other in a democratic community is to rehearse problems together. It's a kind of constructive exercise, but one in which disagreement is paramount, one in which we want to hear ideas that don't agree with the majority because they'll lead us to new ways of constructing the problem, new ways of trying to solve the problem, problems with the way that we're trying to solve the problem, which we certainly want to know before we embark on a final attempted solution. And even that solution, according to Medina, can be revisited later if we find out more information later. Maybe that there's a person who's unhappy now who wasn't unhappy before, or maybe that actually the solution we thought was a solution doesn't work, right? And so we need to revisit it for that reason. Both of those things will be allowed on this model. Medina's Epistemology of Resistance will revolve around resistant experiences and resistant imaginations, the, quote, beneficial epistemic friction that significant differences in experiences and imagination can produce, unquote. So our democratic epistemic interactions will aim at perfecting not only our practices, but also our own sensibilities. It's going to be about not just doing things differently, but also seeing things differently, being sensitive in new ways to information around us and to other people's testimony. Now we're going to describe some of our normative commitments, and these are roughly 3. The first one is the imperative of epistemic interaction, and that commitment amounts to the commitment that democratic sensibilities require free and equal epistemic interaction among heterogeneous groups that are part of society. So epistemic interaction is imperative in a democracy. And Medina says that we should favor interaction over integration. So interaction is not the same as integration. Communicating with each other, not the same as blending together, right? That doesn't necessarily result from communication. Second of all, there's an expressibility requirement, which says that different groups should have the opportunity to coalesce in a public with expressive capacities so that they can articulate their shared experiences and perspectives. Thirdly, there's a responsiveness requirement, which says that social and epistemic conditions of communication and interaction should be such that the expressions of a public have the proper uptake by other publics and by society as a whole. So in order to have epistemic interaction, we need to be able to express what we think, right, in a way that can be articulated and shared. And we also need to be responsive to the things that have been expressed. So expressibility and responsiveness are two components of the imperative of epistemic interaction. Medina is now going to turn to arguing that as a whole, once we've talked about the different components, this experimentalist part and this normative part, the resistance model of democracy, of epistemic democratic practices, is better than the consensus model. And this is for 4 reasons, roughly. First of all, the agreement requirements lead to undue pressure on and coercion of dissenting minorities. So if you're a minority group, understood here as like a minority opinion, the agreement model or the consensus model is going to want to erase you, to join you in with the majority. And that's pressure and that's coercion, and it's not good. Medina thinks that's one reason we don't like agreement. Also, the consensus model runs the risk of suppressing public airing of and responsiveness to continuing reservations of a decision. If we say that our aim as a society is to achieve consensus, and most people agree, but you're still really unhappy, there might be social pressure against your saying anything about being unhappy with the state of affairs. It's just going to be too high cost, and it might not come to anything. So your opinions are going to be suppressed because they don't match the majority opinion, which is supposed to be a consensus, right? But on the other hand, the resistance model is good because it keeps open minority dissent. And it reminds us that any decision will remain beset by unresolved objections. So Medina thinks it's good that the resistance model keeps us aware of the fact that any decision we come to is at best preliminary at any one point in time. Everything can be revisited all the time. The resistance model also sees democratic interaction as broader and deeper than reaching or breaking consensus. It's not just about coming to an agreement and that's it, right? Democratic interactions are primarily going to be about communicative engagements, about those moments of talking, disagreeing, and then further discussing, right? Among which the convergence and divergence are ultimately transitory and need to be revisited constantly. So as a result of an interaction, we might agree sometimes, and sometimes we're going to disagree. And whether we agree or disagree, that itself might change over time. And that's good on the resistance model. That's not necessarily a bad thing if we don't find ourselves consistent with respect to whether we agree or disagree on the issues as we go along. So basically, Medina says you should adopt the resistance model instead of the consensus model. And let me show you, and this is what the rest of the book is going to do, let me show you what work we can do with that resistance model. You need resistance, you need friction in order to walk on a surface, right? So why not say that you need resistance in order to have a productive democratic society? What if that disagreement is the friction that we need to move forward? The final couple things I'll say about this introductory chapter are, I'll go over very quickly Medina's methodological commitments for his view throughout the rest of the book. And also I'll talk a bit about what resistance is. We'll need to analyze that a little bit more. So Medina's methodological commitments, first of all, are to the non-ideal as opposed to the ideal. So we want to be practical. We want to be grounded in the real and not necessarily the best way things could be. The resistance model is really grounded in how things are around here right now, as opposed to always what it could be that we should all aim towards. The ideal might shift over time, right? Secondly, to particularism over abstraction and generality, which can be distorting according to him. So we don't necessarily want to be universalists. We don't want to say the answers that we come to apply to everybody everywhere. We want to be consciously particularist and say, all right, the things that we've come to, that applies to us right here, right now, insofar as we're embodied in this way and interacting in this way, that's just about here. And that can be productive and helpful. Thirdly, he's methodologically committed to empiricism and to fallibilism. So basically empiricism using experience as a source of information, and also to fallibilism. So there's never absolute final proof of the correctness of our norms, as opposed to the positivist position, which sees it as possible that we're going to come up with necessarily true analytic statements that describe for all time what is the case. So empiricism and fallibilism. And finally, he's committed to what he calls meliorism, which is to making things better without being shackled to any particular picture of the best. So incremental changes slowly over time. That's what he's committed to over the idea of complete and systemic, instantaneous change, like you might see in a Marxist kind of frame, right, where the moment of revolution is kind of a one-time changing of the structure of society that fixes everything. So he's more an incrementalist, what he calls a meliorist, where he thinks we can make small productive changes across time that make things better without necessarily committing to what could be best, all things considered. So implicit in this commitment to meliorism is a rejection of the normality of justice and the abnormality of injustice. Rather, it sees injustice as pervasive. And it starts with that. It basically says, no matter what we do, injustice will kind of always be around. We should never think that we've come to a place where there's no injustice anywhere, maybe because it'll blind us to the existence of injustice still around, right? And so we just want to say, you know what? Injustice is the normal state of affairs. It's the one that we tend to find ourselves in. So we should assume that that's the position we're in and try to work better from there, as opposed to try to instantaneously create a society with no injustice in it, which might be impossible, or at really at least very impractical. Maybe there's always somebody who's negatively affected. It's just that there's degrees of bad or something like that. He doesn't say any of that, of course, but he's just saying he's not committed to the idea that there is an, in principle, perfectly just society. So the final thing I'll talk about with respect to introducing this book is what resistance is supposed to be. And to talk about where resistance is, Medina talks about the perspective of Foucault and also of Wittgenstein. So from Foucault, he says, resistance is complicated and it's plural. Quote, resistance is never in a position of exteriority in relation to power, unquote. In order to understand how it works, we need to understand, quote, the strictly relational character of power relations, unquote. So basically what we're saying is that resistance can be found and should be looked for in the very entrails of privilege and mainstream practices and perspectives. We're not going to find resistance only in these marginal locations away from the centers of power. Resistance is never exterior to power. It's never other than. It's always finding itself in the places where power tries to apply itself. And so we're going to find it just about everywhere. We should look for signs of resistance everywhere in society. And some of them will be small and some of them will be large. But, if you have power relations in a society, basically, just like imagine the following scenario. Suppose that there's a particular norm that applies to you, like a gender norm or something. And you have really roughly three options when it comes to norms, social norms applying to you. You can either agree with them, not resist them at all. You can highly disagree with them and try to resist them, right? Rebel against them, maybe in mild ways, maybe in strong ways. Or you can try to pretend that they don't exist, try to be neutral, which is really hard. But some people try it sometimes. You can try to be neutral with respect to a norm and just sort of try not to defend it, not to attack it, but just kind of live your life, right? But anytime that you have a power relation in society, because you have those three options, you're probably going to find some people who take the resistance option. There's probably, because insofar as we are free human beings with free will, if that's a thing, some of us will be tempted to find ourselves in opposition to the power relations. So resistance isn't something that is happening nowhere until someone imagines it, right? Resistance is something that, according to Foucault, is kind of happening all the time in lots of parts of society. And of course, the degree of resistance will vary greatly. The need for resistance will vary greatly in different parts of society. But it's really rare that you get a society where everybody just is always fine with the way things are, right? In most parts of society, that doesn't tend to happen. So that's the idea of resistance from Foucault. There's this other part that Medina pulls from Wittgenstein. So Wittgenstein, one of the things he talks about are language games, which are ways that we construct meaning. He thinks that all of our use of language is basically like a complicated social game that we're always playing. And he calls these language games. So language games, according to Wittgenstein, offer us opportunities to develop alternative practices. Because if language is a social practice and language is socially constructed, it's set by the society, but at any one point in time, I can, as an individual or maybe as a small group, try to challenge the usage that other people make use of in language, right? It can be something silly, like I invent a pun that you haven't heard before, or a metaphor that you haven't heard before. Or it could be something deeper where I try to use exactly the same word that you use, but use it so that it means the opposite of what you use it for. And that can be interesting, frustrating, it can be fun. The word game here is supposed to also apply to war games, which aren't hilarious, so we don't just mean the word game in the sense of play. We mean the word game in the sense of rule-based social practices that have structures that can be changed, right? So language games, if we think about language games, we can also think about inherent in them opportunities to develop alternative practices, different ways that we could play the game. So here's a quote from Peg O'Connor in a 2002 article. Wittgenstein says in Uncertainty that a group can use their language game as a base from which to combat others. The language games of coming out and breaking silence, all with all their attendant activities and newly created and recognizable meanings, are in many ways loci from which to fight against the dominant language games we have all played. So Peg O'Connor is using the queer practice of coming out and breaking silence about being queer as a kind of resistance within the language game. And the language itself can be a place from which we resist, right? Now, Medina says, we need to look for possibilities of resistance in every discursive practice and every social location in order to identify the wide spectrum of practices of resistance in which epistemic friction can be found. He adds, as Naomi Sheeman and other Wittgensteinians, including myself, have argued, Wittgenstein offers other resources for resistance besides inventing new meanings or abandoning existing practices. Linguistic resistance can be internal to the oppressive language games themselves, and it can aim at the subversion of the very normative core of mainstream practices, which Sheeman calls queering the center, and what I describe as speaking from elsewhere while remaining within. Medina adds, it is a mistake to think that the forms of exclusion, subordination, and marginalization that we can find in mainstream culture can be resisted only from the outside, and not also from within. The contextualist account of resistance I provide in this book covers cases of internal resistance as well as cases of external resistance. For the multifaceted activity of resisting is conceptualized as contending with, and not exclusively or fundamentally as contending against. So resisting isn't always about opposition or exclusion, right? Medina says it can feel more like being pulled in different directions from the inside, like being torn from within. Experiencing resistance can often feel like a rupture that one does not know what to do with, at least initially, like feeling perplexity. I am interested in the experiential and phenomenological aspects of resistance, but I am even more interested in its agential and practical aspects. For resistance is not simply something that happens to us, but it is fundamentally something we do or fail to do, and for which we have to take responsibility. So he talks about resistance as something that is about our being agents, our being epistemic agents. That's one of the reasons why we accrue this requirement of being epistemically responsible and resisting things that are epistemically bad for us, or right. We have resistance to, when we have resistance to things, that indicates something about our position with respect to democratic others with epistemic ideas other than our own, right? So because we are subjects, we have responsibilities. And what are the responsibilities for Medina of this resistant subjectivity? He thinks that we might have epistemic duties to resist certain things. For example, to fight against ignorance, to know oneself and others in certain respects, to learn and facilitate the learning of others, to resist epistemic vices and work toward epistemic virtues, ameliorate epistemic habits and attitudes, and collaborate in the pursuit of epistemic justice. So those are things that we might be obligated to do. We might have these requirements. We might have duties toward building knowledge and questioning meanings. It's not just about duties to do and act like in beneficent ways. It might also be duties on how to properly think and communicate in society, and to how to uptake experiences. There might be rules for that sort of thing. And this thing that he calls the obligation or the duty to resist has to be contextualized on his view, because differently situated subjects might have different, or differential at least, epistemic responsibilities. So basically, if this model is right, we can build a resistance model of democracy. We can understand resistance as something that can happen within structures and not just outside of structures, and something that we actually live through all the time, these like mini resistances. Sometimes they're resistances that happen within us. Sometimes we resist ourselves in our own conception of ourselves, right? And maybe there are duties that we have to resist in certain circumstances. So if we have duties, if these are things that we ought to do, how do we understand them, and who do they accrue to? So in a way, Medina's book, the rest of the book, will be in part interested in the analysis of epistemic injustice and epistemic oppression, the idea of active ignorance and epistemic friction, like analyzing all these concepts, and who has epistemic authority and all of that. But also he'll be interested in understanding what epistemic responsibilities we have in relation to resistance, in relation to building epistemically democratic societies. And that will lead to a discussion of his take on epistemic virtue. So he's going to talk about what are the features, the character traits of epistemically well-built, of the good epistemic character, right? So those are the virtues, and the vices are the features of a bad epistemic character. And on his view, it's going to turn out that which virtues and vices we ought to have depends on what position in society we are in. So what position in society you're in determines the kinds of skill sets, the kinds of character traits you should seek to cultivate most ardently. So to give you a sketch, right, if I am in a powerful position in society, I should work to cultivate my listening skills, right? Because I'm going to tend to be the one who's listened to more often. And so I'm going to have to need to be like more humble and more willing to shut up than other people. I might also need to build up my curiosity, my open-mindedness, right? But if I'm someone who doesn't always have epistemic privilege, it might be one of my responsibilities to try to build up hermeneutic tools and concepts to explain my experiences to others, to aim to communicate more. Maybe resistance itself is an epistemic virtue that I can build. Maybe there are epistemic vices to self-ignorance or to ignorance of other people, insensitivity to other people's experiences. Like, just because you're oppressed doesn't mean that there aren't other people who are oppressed. So maybe you have some duties that accrue to you, even if you experience epistemic difficulties in society, right? So these next chapters in the book will deal with a lot of those issues and a couple more. And the book will end with a discussion of resistant imaginations and radical solidarity. So basically the thing that we're hoping to build as a result of reading about all of these ways that we can be epistemically involved in our democratic societies, the ultimate goal is to produce people, agents that have not only resistant imaginations, that engage in productive ways in disagreements with others and try to imagine different social futures, but also will try to build radical solidarity. So solidarity with each other that's not merely about agreement. And that's what makes it radical. We want to build solidarity that's a solidarity that moves beyond the requirement of consensus. And that's one of the reasons why I thought this book was very powerful to talk about. And I'm looking forward to discussing it with you in the coming weeks. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time. Bye.